The first image that never leaves me isn't of a person at all. It's that thing sitting alone in the gray, the way you'd set a broken toy out on the driveway after a fire. The air was still thick with wet smoke, and the sky had that flat, colorless light you get after a hard night of sirens. There it stood, charred around the muzzle and shoulders, glass eyes, clouded fur, stiff with soot like it had been dragged out of another century and left to cool. The smell of burned plastic and singed hair clung to it, clung to everything, and you could hear little bits of ash skittering across the concrete whenever the breeze shifted. At first glance, it was just a big stuffed bear, the kind you see in old hunting cabins, frozen mid-growl with its paws half raised. But there was a tear low on the belly, and from that dark slit a strip of bright blue fabric pressed outward, wrinkled and dirty, like something trying to breathe through the sawdust. I remember the way one of the deputies stared at that spot, his boots crunching on glass, while everyone else pretended it was just another ruined prop. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from and follow if you believe some names should never fade. Years before that morning in the smoke life was much quieter, and my world felt small in the best possible way. Our house sat on a dead-end street in a neighborhood of modest ranch homes and tired maples just outside Portland. On fall mornings, you could step out onto our front porch and smell damp bark and cold asphalt. Hear the hush of cars slipping along the main road a few blocks over their tires, whispering on wet pavement. The porch boards were rough under my bare feet, and the rail had a thin line of green moss where the sun never quite reached. Back then, my days were measured in school drop-offs, grocery runs, and the soft chime of the office door when clients came in with coffee-stained paperwork. Dan's days looked different from mine. He left early most mornings just before the sky turned fully blue, carrying his metal travel mug and his worn laptop bag. His company sat in an industrial strip near the river. Nothing glamorous, just a squat brick building with humming transformers out back and a faded sign out front. He worked on electrical systems, the kind of job that made him come home with ink on his hands and complicated diagrams folded in his pocket. In the evenings, he would spread those sheets out on our kitchen table, the overhead light turning the paper yellow and catching the little silver threads of gray that were starting to show in his hair. The smell of whatever I was cooking, garlic onions, sometimes just boxed macaroni mixed with the faint metallic scent that followed him home. The smell of solder and burned dust from circuit boards. He wasn't a loud man. When he laughed, it was more in his eyes than his voice, and when he was tired, his shoulders would slump in a way most people wouldn't notice unless they watched him every day the way I did. Our evenings were a gentle repetition. The slap of backpacks on the floor when the kids came home, the rattle of the dishwasher, the television murmuring from the living room with the local news or some old western playing in the background. Outside, the neighborhood settled into its own rhythm, lawns being mowed one last time before winter dogs barking at nothing in particular, the occasional pop of a basketball hitting a driveway. If there was one place where Dan truly exhaled, it was the woods. That's what he called it, just the woods, even though it meant a specific stretch of the Willamette National Forest he'd been wandering through since he was a teenager. Our garage shelves were lined with its evidence neatly rolled maps held together with rubber bands. Boots with dried mud crusted in the tread, a stove blackened from 100 little campfires. When he picked up his pack, you could hear the soft clink of metal carabiners and the faint rustle of nylon straps, like the sound of someone getting ready to leave before they'd said the words out loud. It didn't start as anything unusual. For years, his hikes were just part of the background as familiar as the creak in our hallway floor. He liked short loops he'd tell anyone who asked, nothing extreme, just enough to feel his legs burn and clear the static from his mind. He always promised he'd be back the next day, always called from a gas station or a turnout when he had a signal, his voice crackling over the line with a little wind noise while I folded laundry or wiped crumbs off the counter. The forest for him was a place to think, not to escape, or at least that's how it felt back then. I remember one particular October week so clearly because on the surface it was ordinary. The rain had returned after a long, dusty summer, and the town seemed to breathe out a sigh of relief. You could smell wet leaves everywhere on the sidewalks and the gutters plastered to the steps of our front porch. The air had that cool metallic bite that tells you the year is winding down. I'd drive to work with the heater on low, listening to the wipers drag across the glass and the quiet hum of oldies radio, thinking mostly about the rising price of groceries and whether the kids needed new coats. Dan was working late almost every night that week. He would come home with a faint groove between his eyebrows, his eyes ringed with the red of too much screen time. The plant was pushing through a big project, some upgrade for a client outside the city, and he kept saying it felt like there was always one more bug to fix. I'd hand him a reheated plate, the fork clinking softly against the ceramic, and he'd eat standing at the counter, sometimes staring at nothing in particular. The kids would tumble around his legs, the smell of their shampoo rising up from their damp hair after bath time, and he'd eventually sink down onto the couch with them, letting their chatter pull his mind away from schematics and deadlines. We had small arguments in those days, the kind couples collect without meaning to. I'd complain that he was leaving his boots in the hallway again, tracking in the sour smell of wet leather and forest mud. He'd tease me for leaving half-empty coffee cups everywhere, the rims stained a soft brown. There were bigger conversations we edged around too, about money, about the kids getting older, about whether we'd ever actually take the road trip we kept talking about to the coast. They weren't dramatic fights, just those little frictions that come with long familiarity, as quiet and constant as the hum of the refrigerator at night. Every so often, though, I would catch a different kind of silence around him. I'd find him standing at the sliding glass door, late the porch light throwing a pale circle onto the wet deck, his reflection faint in the glass. The backyard smelled of cold earth and cedar, and the neighbors' wind chimes clicked softly in the dark. He would stand there with his hands in the pockets of his jeans, shoulders forward, looking past his own reflection into the shadows where the fence line disappeared into blackberry vines. If I asked what he was thinking about, he'd shrug and say something simple: work or the kids or the fact that the lawn needed one more mowing before the rains really started. But there was a distance in his voice sometimes, like part of him was already somewhere under taller trees. The kids loved to hear about his hikes, even if most of the stories were the same. At dinner, with the overhead light warming the kitchen to a soft yellow, Tyler would ask him what the trail smelled like in summer, and Dan would describe the dusty sweetness of dry pine needles and sun-baked bark. Megan would ask about animals, her small fingers tracing patterns in the condensation on her water glass, and he'd tell her about deer stepping out onto the trail at dawn, their hooves almost silent on the damp soil. Sometimes he'd admit he was nervous about cougars, or about losing his footing near a ravine, but it was always in that half-joking way, the way you talk about something you respect, but don't expect to ever really meet. That October, the idea of one more hike before winter really hits started floating around the house the way certain thoughts do, light at first, then heavier. He mentioned it in passing while brushing his teeth, his voice muffled by the foam, the bathroom mirror fogged from the hot water. He brought it up again when we were paying bills at the dining table, the stacks of envelopes smelling faintly of paper and ink. He said the colors were changing fast in the forest, that the maples and vine maples were going red and gold, and if he waited too long, the first real snow would make his favorite loop less accessible. I remember asking him which trail he was thinking about this time. He traced a little circle in the condensation on his beer bottle, the glass sweating against his fingers. That loop off the highway near the river, he said, meaning Pine Ridge without needing to say the name. I knew it by his description, by the way his shoulders relaxed when he talked about the overlook where you could see the water bending through the trees. In my mind, I saw what he always tried to show me in his photos. The pale sky, the dark line of the hills, the river moving like a strip of dull metal between them. I also saw the narrow highway slick with rain, and the way fog liked to sit low in those passes, erasing the world beyond a few car lengths. If I had any hesitation, It was small and soft, then more of a passing shiver than a true warning. I remember hearing about a hiker getting lost in another part of the state earlier that year. The news anchor's voice flat as she read the story, the scrolling text at the bottom of the screen glowing a cold blue. Dan shook his head when he saw it, the fork pausing halfway to his mouth. "That's what happens when people go off trail with no map," he'd said, the smell of tomato sauce and oregano filling the kitchen as I packed leftovers away. "I don't do that." And it was true, he was careful, almost stubbornly so, about staying on marked paths. The Friday before his planned hike, the rain held off for most of the day, but left everything damp and chilled. At the office, I could smell the faint mildew of wet coats hanging by the door, and the sharp tang of the copier warming up as we rushed through end-of-week paperwork. My coworkers talked about football games and Halloween decorations, their voices echoing lightly off the beige walls. By the time I pulled into our driveway that evening, the sky had settled into that deep, uniform gray that makes the streetlights flicker on earlier than you expect. The house windows glowed a warm orange behind the sheer curtains, and I could see the movement of silhouettes in the living room, Megan jumping from couch cushion to couch cushion, Tyler sprawled on the rug. Dan had his pack out on the kitchen table when I walked in, the nylon smelling faintly of old campfire smoke and pine sap. The zipper teeth made a soft rasping sound as he checked each pocket, lining up his gear with the kind of quiet focus he rarely gave anything else. A map folded into a neat rectangle, a small stove, a metal mug that had a tiny dent in the rim. The kids hovered nearby, fingers itching to poke at everything. He shooed them back with a half-hearted wave, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. We talked about the usual things that night. What time he planned to leave, whether he'd be back late the next day or early the following morning if I needed him to pick up anything in Bend before coming home. The oven ticked as it cooled, the last of the heat fading into the house, and the smell of baked chicken lingered in the air. Outside, a light drizzle began tapping softly against the kitchen window. Later, after the kids were in bed and the house had gone quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional whoosh of a car passing on the main road, we lay side by side in the dark. The room smelled faintly of laundry detergent and the cool night air seeping in around the window frame. I could feel the warmth of his shoulder inches from mine, the mattress dipping slightly under his weight. We talked about little things, his project at work, a bill that needed to be paid, whether we should replace the aging car next year or wait. His voice was low and even, and every so often the headlights from a passing car would slide across the ceiling in a thin, moving line. Somewhere in that conversation there was a pause, one of those small silences that come when both people are thinking about something they're not quite putting into words. I remember hearing the rain pick up outside, soft at first, and then steadier, like fingers drumming lightly on the roof. He let out a long breath and said he was looking forward to the quiet out there. "Just a quick loop," he added. Back before I knew it. I nodded in the dark, the sheets cool against my legs, and told him to text me when he got to the trailhead, mostly out of habit. The next morning, the alarm went off before the sky had fully decided on a color. The bedroom was dim and blue, the air cool against my face where it peeked out from under the blanket. I heard the rustle of fabric as he sat up, the soft thud of his feet on the carpet. The smell of coffee drifted down the hallway a few minutes later, mingling with the faint, closed-up scent of the house before the day starts. I stayed in bed a little longer, listening to the quiet clink of a spoon against a mug and the low creak of the front door as he stepped out onto the porch. By the time I joined him, he was already out by the truck, breath fogging faintly in the cold air, his pack resting in the open passenger side. The pavement was slick and dark, and the streetlights cast small halos on the wet road. We didn't make a big scene of it. We never did. A quick kiss, a reminder to drive carefully over the pass, a joke about him bringing back decent pictures this time instead of nothing but trees and rocks. The truck's engine rumbled to life, headlights cutting through the fine mist. I wrapped my sweater a little tighter around myself and watched the red glow of his taillights disappear at the end of the street swallowed by the main road. Inside the house felt oddly muffled without him, the heater clicking on and sending a faint warmth through the vents. The kids were still asleep, their doors closed, their rooms dark except for a sliver of light under one where a nightlight glowed. I moved through the kitchen on autopilot, putting his empty mug in the sink, straightening the map he'd left on the counter, just a corner of it sticking out from under the salt shaker. Outside, the drizzle kept up its gentle tapping on the windows, a soft, steady sound that seemed to fill all the spaces where his voice had been. I told myself it was just another Saturday. I made coffee, flipped on the small radio we kept near the stove, and let the low murmur of the morning news blend with the sound of the rain. Still, when I walked past the front window, I found my eyes drifting to the spot where his truck had been the driveway, now slick and empty, the porch light still burning a pale yellow against the gray. I reached for the switch, hesitated for just a second without knowing why, and then left it on a little longer than I usually would. The small circle of light pressing out into a quiet street that suddenly felt larger and farther than it had the night before. That Saturday began with the kind of ordinary noise a house makes when everyone is waking up at different speeds. Drawers, sliding open, the soft smack of feet on carpet, the kettle clicking as it cooled. By mid-morning, the drizzle had eased, leaving the street outside washed clean and shining, and I remember thinking it was the kind of day where everything felt predictable. The kids were still in their pajamas, arguing softly over which cartoon to watch, and I was standing at the kitchen counter with my coffee listening to the last drops of rain tick against the window. Nothing felt out of place. Nothing hinted at the shift waiting just a few hours ahead. Around mid-afternoon, I sent Dan a quick text the way I always did when he went out on those short hikes. Just something simple, everything okay, sent more out of routine than worry. I didn't expect an instant reply. The hills around Pine Ridge were known for bad reception, and his messages often came in bursts hours later like postcards washed up on shore. But when the phone stayed quiet longer than usual, I found myself checking it again, tapping the screen like that might wake it up. The house felt a little too still while I waited, as if it were listening with me. By early evening, the cloud cover thickened into that pale Oregon gray that seems to settle over everything like a lid. I tried calling once just to hear the ring, and the sound that came back was thin and sharp like a call bouncing around inside a metal box. It didn't even reach voicemail, just cut off with a dry click that didn't belong in the normal rhythm of our lives. I hit call again immediately, then again, and each time that same clipped tone returned. The kids were still running around the living room, their voices bright and careless, unaware that something small but essential had shifted in the air behind me. I told myself he was probably already on the road, maybe heading down one of those narrow forest highways where the trees press in so close they turn afternoon into twilight. I imagined him pulling off at a turnout, rubbing his eyes, the heat still coming off the truck's engine. I tried to hear his voice in my memory, the calm certainty he had whenever I worried too early. "I'm fine, sweetheart. You know how it is out there." But the silence on the other end of the line deepened, and with every minute that passed, I felt a thin thread of unease tighten in the center of my chest. When the sun dipped enough to turn the windows into dark mirrors, I sent the kids down the hall for their bedtime routine. The sound of water running in the bathroom echoed through the house, that familiar hiss and splash that usually kept me anchored. I kept expecting to hear his key scrape in the lock or the porch step creak under his weight the way it always did. Instead, all I could hear was the steady hum of the refrigerator and the faint tapping of branches against the siding. By 9, I could no longer pretend this was a simple delay. I tried calling again, but this time the call didn't even attempt to connect. It ended immediately, leaving the screen blank and unhelpful. I set the phone down on the counter, picked it up again, then set it down once more. My hands felt colder than they should have. I checked the front window, scanning the street for headlights, and saw only the long, empty stretch of wet asphalt reflecting the yellow glow of the neighbor's porch light. I sent one last text. Let me know you're okay, even though the earlier calls told me the phone wasn't reaching anything at all. I stared at the bubbles on the screen, willing them to shift into a typing signal, but the message sat untouched, a small gray block that felt heavier than it looked. By 10, the house had gone quiet except for the soft breathing of the children behind their closed doors. I tried turning on the TV for noise, but the flickering light made the living room feel colder, like the colors didn't want to settle. So I turned it off again and sat at the edge of the couch with my elbows on my knees, listening to the faint tick of the baseboard heater warming up. I told myself to wait until 11. Just one more hour. No sense in calling anyone too early. No sense in imagining the worst. People lose track of time out there. The woods are wide and calm and easy to get wrapped up in. Still, as the clock hands crept closer to 11, the feeling in my stomach swelled into something heavier, an old instinctive dread I didn't yet have a name for. I tried to picture him walking out of the forest, brushing dirt off his boots, laughing about some minor mishap. But no matter how many times I tried to summon that image, it wouldn't stay. It flickered like a candle in a draft, then slipped away entirely, leaving only the echo of a thought I wasn't ready to form. I checked the weather report as if the radar might offer some explanation. The map showed pockets of fog moving across the mountains, the kind that sits low and turns the trails into dim tunnels. But there was no storm, no landslide, nothing that made sense of why he wasn't home. I whispered his name into the quiet, even though there was no one around to hear me but the walls. At 11 on the dot, I called the Highway Patrol's non-emergency line. The dispatch operator had a patient voice, the kind you hear during long winter storms when people slide into ditches. She asked me when he was due home, what he was driving, which trail he planned to hike. I gave her every detail I could think of: his green truck, the route through the pass, the way he usually checked in when he reached the trailhead. She typed quietly, the faint clatter of keys coming through the line like distant rain. She told me what I already knew they would say, that it was probably nothing, that hikers run late all the time, that phones die in the forest or fall out of service. She said to give it a little longer. I thanked her, though my voice shook in a way I tried to hide. When I hung up, the house seemed to exhale around me, the silence expanding again. I made myself a cup of tea, even though I knew I wouldn't drink it. The steam rose in soft curls, carrying the faint scent of chamomile, but the warmth in the mug felt wrong in my hands, useless, almost out of place. I set it aside and moved from room to room, picking things up and setting them back down without meaning to. His jacket still hung on the wall by the door, its familiar shape making my eyes burn. I touched the collar, feeling the cold fabric under my fingers, and had to pull my hand back. Midnight came, then 1:30, and the quiet began to feel like a weight pushing down on the house, making every breath feel slightly too loud. I walked out onto the porch, wrapping my sweater tight around me. The air smelled of wet dirt and distant wood smoke from someone's chimney. The street was empty, the pavement glinting under the street lamp as if it were coated in glass. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once, then fell silent again. At one point, I caught myself listening for the sound of his truck, its particular low rumble, the one I could identify even before it turned the corner. But the only sounds were the drip of water from the gutter and the faint buzz of the porch light overhead, its glow casting a pale halo across the steps. I don't remember sitting down, but I found myself on the porch bench with my hands clasped tight, staring out into the stillness. My phone lay beside me, screen dark, waiting for something that wasn't coming. Every few minutes I'd tap it awake, checking for missed calls or messages that weren't there. Sometime after 1:30, I noticed my breathing had changed. It had taken on a shallow, uneven rhythm that made my chest feel constricted. I stood up, went back inside, and locked the door more forcefully than I meant to. The click of the deadbolt echoed in the front hall in a way that made the hair on my arms rise. I paced the living room, the carpet soft under my bare feet. the windows reflecting my own tired shape back at me. The digital clock on the stove marked the passing minutes with a tiny red blink, steady and unforgiving. I tried to tell myself again that he'd walk in any moment, laughing off the delay. But something inside me had already shifted. A quiet, undeniable certainty that whatever had kept him out there was larger than a dead battery or lost track of time. Around 2, I finally sat down at the kitchen table and dialed the sheriff's office. My voice felt distant to my own ears, like I was speaking from inside a fog. The dispatcher listened, and this time I heard something different in her tone. A slight softening, a hint of concern that hadn't been there earlier. She said she would log the call and pass it to the on-duty deputy. She told me to keep my phone close. So I waited. The house felt colder, as if the temperature had dropped while I wasn't looking. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed muted now, swallowed by the wide stillness pressing against the windows. I stood near the front door, holding my phone so tightly my knuckles ached, listening to the night settle around the house like a heavy blanket. It couldn't have been more than 20 minutes later when I saw a sweep of headlights slowly round the corner. They moved deliberately, too controlled to belong to someone coming home from a late shift or a night out. The beams stretched long across the wet street, then glided up our driveway, illuminating the row of dark bushes by the porch. When the engine cut, the quiet that followed made my pulse jump. A county cruiser sat there idling softly as its lights dimmed, and through the windshield I could see the outline of a deputy leaning forward, reaching for his hat, before stepping out into the rain-darkened night. The deputy who stepped out of that cruiser in the early hours had the kind of quiet presence that made the night feel even larger around us. He walked up the driveway slowly, rain tapping on the brim of his hat, and when he reached the porch he introduced himself as Deputy Calloway, voice low and steady, like he didn't want to wake the house. The porch light hummed above us, throwing a pale glow across his jacket and the wet gravel behind him. He asked a handful of questions when I'd last heard from Dan, which trail he planned to take when he was expected home, and I answered as clearly as I could, though my hands felt unsteady against the railing. By then the children had woken and were standing inside the doorway, their small shapes framed in the warm kitchen light. When the deputy saw them, he softened his tone even further, assuring me they'd send someone to check the parking areas near the trail before dawn. He didn't say anything alarming, but something in the way he avoided meeting my eyes told me he understood this wasn't simply a late return. He stayed only a few minutes before heading back to his car, promising to call as soon as he had anything. As his taillights faded down the street, the silence that followed pressed against the windows with a heaviness I hadn't felt before. I sat awake at the kitchen table, listening to the soft tick of the wall clock and the wind brushing the side of the house, and every so often I would stand to look out toward the road as if his truck might appear after all. But the hours stretched thin and nothing changed. Just after sunrise, when the sky turned the dull color of unpolished steel, the phone rang. I answered before the second tone finished, heart pulling tight. It was Deputy Calloway again, saying they'd found Dan's truck near the trailhead. His voice held something careful, something measured, and the world around me seemed to shift slightly, as if the floor had settled at a different angle. He said the vehicle was locked and untouched and that a ranger was already there waiting for additional units. He asked if I could meet them. I told the kids to get their shoes on, though I knew they sensed enough to realize this wasn't a family outing. The drive over the pass felt longer than I remembered it. Low fog clung to the slopes, moving in soft waves across the asphalt. The trees lining the highway were dark with moisture, their branches hanging heavy, and the closer we got to Bend, the more the air took on that cold earth smell that sits deep in the forest floor during October. At the trailhead turnoff, the gravel crunched beneath the tires, and the sound echoed strangely in the stillness. A few county vehicles were parked in a loose line, their radios crackling faintly through open windows. Dan's truck sat at the far end, the dark green paint speckled with rain. When I stepped out of the car, the air carried the scent of pine needles and damp bark, and the coolness wrapped around my arms like a reminder that this was no longer the safe, familiar world we knew. A ranger named Colin, about mid-30s with a trimmed beard and mud on his boots, approached first. He spoke gently, telling me they hadn't touched anything inside. Through the window I could see his jacket folded on the passenger seat, the map he always carried tucked underneath it, and an old thermos still resting in the cup holder. I remember pressing my palm lightly to the cool glass, looking at that jacket, as though it might tell me something. It didn't. It simply sat there, shaped by absence. By mid-morning, more vehicles arrived, sheriff's units, an SUV carrying 2 dog handlers, and a search and rescue truck with extra packs stacked in the back. The air filled with the low murmur of voices, the scrape of boots on gravel, and the occasional burst from a radio. A sense of organization began to form around us, a shift from personal worry into something larger and more structured. Maps were spread across a tailgate, the pages flapping slightly in the chill breeze as deputies marked likely paths in yellow and red pencil. One of the handlers brought out the dogs, a pair of German shepherds, their collars jangling softly as they moved with purposeful steps. I stood off to the side with the kids, their hands each gripping one of mine. The scent of wet earth and crushed pine needles drifted on the air, and I felt a strange detachment settling in, as though the world in front of me was happening behind a pane of glass. A detective I hadn't met before approached with a quiet nod. This was Detective Alan Briggs, the man who would later become the center of everything that followed. He spoke with a calm authority, explaining they'd start with the loop trail and expand outward. His voice was steady, but he kept glancing at the forest the way someone looks at a locked door they know holds something inside. The first teams moved in soon after, boots sinking slightly into the damp soil, dogs pulling ahead with noses close to the ground. Their movements cut soft paths through the ferns and fallen leaves, leaving shifting lines in the landscape like fragile strokes of chalk. I watched until their colors blended into the greens and browns of the forest, until the trilling sound of their radios faded into the distance. The wind was faint but constant, carrying the scent of moss and cold stone, and in the long pauses between footsteps, I could hear the distant trickle of a stream. While the hours stretched, deputies kept returning to the trailhead, wiping moisture from their faces, shaking off their jackets, and reporting each section cleared. The word "nothing" hung in the air again and again, said in different tones, matter-of-fact, subdued, occasionally edged with disbelief. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken branches pointed out, no dropped gear or stray footprints that led anywhere meaningful. Everything seemed untouched, as if the forest had quietly erased whatever had happened. Around early afternoon, a volunteer group arrived, locals from Bend, and a few from nearby towns. They carried their own packs, some with worn patches from previous searches, and their presence added a low hum of conversation that briefly softened the tension. One older man named Jim approached me, hands tucked into the pockets of his thick canvas jacket. He told me he'd lived in the area his whole life and knew the trails well enough to walk them half asleep. His voice held that rough kindness you sometimes hear in people who have spent long years outdoors. He promised they'd cover as much ground as they could before sunset. When the dogs returned from their first sweep, their handlers shook their heads. One dog had briefly picked up a scent near a fork in the trail, only to lose it near a patch of smooth rock close to a small stream. The handler explained it softly, not wanting to alarm me. Moisture and moving water can scatter scent and confuse even well-trained animals. I nodded, though the explanation felt thin in my ears. That quiet rock bed with its slick stones and rushing water would stay with me long after that day. As the search widened, small objects were flagged and brought back for me to identify. A piece of blue fabric caught in a branch that turned out to be part of an old tarp. A food wrapper that didn't match anything he'd packed. A faint boot print in the mud that the ranger said looked older, maybe from last week's hikers. Every item stirred a moment of hope, then faded into the background like a shadow dissolving in fog. In the late afternoon, the ranger named Colin walked me a short distance along the trail to show me a small clearing. The soil there had been disturbed lightly, a shallow dip where someone might have knelt or rested. A small ring of stone suggested a fire had been made recently, though any embers were long cold. There was no sign it belonged to Dan. No sign it didn't. The openness of that space surrounded by towering trees felt unsettling. The wind moved gently through the branches, carrying the smell of damp bark, and it struck me that a person could vanish a few yards from this spot and never leave anything behind. Back at the trailhead, theories began to drift through conversations in quiet, half-finished sentences. Some suggested he may have slipped, perhaps hit his head near the stream. Others wondered if he took a wrong turn and followed an unmarked deer trail deeper into the woods. One volunteer mentioned old rumors, stories about reclusive hunters who lived out in the hills, men who avoided people and claimed pieces of land as their own. The way he said it made me stiffen, though he immediately apologized, saying he didn't mean anything by it, just chatter from town. Detective Briggs shot him a look, and the man fell silent. The hours grew heavy as daylight thinned. The sky took on that muted lavender of late October, the kind that makes shadows stretch wider across the ground. Fog began drifting in again, pooling low near the edges of the road. I could hear the frustration in the clipped tones of deputies radioing back and forth updates about trails cleared, about the lack of fresh tracks, about the fading light that would soon force them to regroup. Through all of it, I stood near Dan's truck, sometimes touching the cold metal of the door as though it held warmth from him. The kids sat in the back seat of our car, with the heater on their faces, pale in the bluish afternoon light. I kept checking on them, smoothing their hair or handing them snacks they barely touched. Their eyes followed me each time, searching for reassurance I didn't know how to give. Near dusk, a helicopter made a pass overhead, its thudding rotors rolling across the tree line like distant thunder. Its spotlight cut through the fog in sweeping arcs, illuminating patches of moss-covered ground and glints of water from hidden streams. For a moment, that bright cone of light made the forest look less impenetrable, like the truth might reveal itself if the beam just passed over the right place. But nothing emerged. The helicopter banked, circled once more, then disappeared behind the ridge. When darkness finally fell, it came quickly slipping between the trees and swallowing the last of the daylight. The search teams returned in clusters, their flashlights casting trembling circles on the wet gravel. I could see the exhaustion in their faces, the smeared mud on their pants, the slackness in their shoulders, the way they avoided meeting my eyes. Briggs spoke with them quietly, listening, nodding occasionally, rubbing a hand along the back of his neck like the weight of the day had settled there. I was standing beside the hood of a patrol car when he approached me. His expression was closed, but not unkind. He said they'd done all they safely could for the day. That night searches in terrain like this often did more harm than good. He said they'd be back at first light with more volunteers, more dogs, more equipment. His voice was firm, steady, but there was something in his eyes that felt like the first true acknowledgement of how difficult this might be. As he spoke, a deputy jogged up from the far end of the lot, holding something in his gloved hand. He whispered to Briggs, who glanced at me, then back at the deputy. Briggs told him softly to bag it and mark the location. His tone didn't change, but the way he exhaled afterward made the cold air around us feel even sharper. The deputy walked away with that small, unidentified object, and Briggs stood there for a moment looking toward the dark tree line as if listening for something only he could hear. Then he told me they'd return in the morning. The night pressed in around us, carrying a chill that settled deep in my bones. And as the last headlights turned down the gravel road, leaving only the low hum of a distant generator and the whisper of wind in the branches, I felt a realization settle over me, quiet and absolute. Something had shifted out there, something none of us had yet seen. The morning, everything shifted, was quiet in a way that didn't match the calendar. It was late summer in 2021, hotter than usual, the kind of heat that makes the air feel suspended. I was in my car outside a small grocery store in Bend, waiting for the kids to finish a summer program nearby, when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something in the back of my neck prickled an instinct I'd learned not to ignore over the years. When I picked up, the voice on the other end was calm, official, and carrying a weight I recognized. It was Detective Briggs. He didn't start with pleasantries, didn't ease into anything. He asked where I was and whether I could come down to a residential neighborhood on the north side of town. The way he phrased it carefully, like stepping around a hole he didn't want me to fall into, told me all I needed to know. They had found something. He didn't say that not directly, but it hung between us like smoke. The drive there took only 12 minutes, but every second pressed down like a stone. The sky was washed out blue, bright but muted by haze. When I turned onto the street, he mentioned a thin film of dust shifted under my tires, and I saw the flashing lights before I saw anything else. Fire engines, sheriff's cruisers, and a few unmarked vehicles lined the block. Neighbors stood on curbs, arms folded, their faces drawn into that mix of curiosity and fear that settles over a place before anyone knows what's happened. I parked a half block away and stepped out into the heat. It hit me in the chest, carrying the odor of scorched wood and something chemical beneath it, a sharp, bitter scent that seemed to cling to my skin. A garage had burned or was still burning down to its bones. Smoke curled in thin ribbons above the collapsed roof, and the yard was littered with charred boards and twisted metal. I found Briggs standing near the edge of the caution tape. His jacket was off, draped over a cruiser hood, and he was speaking quietly with a firefighter who kept glancing back toward the wreckage. When Briggs saw me, he walked over with the controlled steps of someone bracing for impact. His face was paler than usual, the lines around his mouth deeper. He told the kids to stay in the car. He didn't raise his voice, but the firmness in it made the air go still. Before he said anything else, a deputy called his name from inside the tape, sharp, urgent. Something in the deputy's tone made my stomach clench. The firefighter next to him motioned for others to join, and a small cluster of them moved toward a shape that had been dragged out of the blackened garage. From where I stood, it looked like an oversized, soot-covered animal prop, maybe a hunting display that had survived the fire. It was a large stuffed bear slumped on its side, fur charred stiff. Its glass eyes were cracked, reflecting flashes of sunlight like shards of ice. I remember wiping my palms on my jeans, though they were already dry. Something about that bear looked wrong, too heavy, too solid in the center. Briggs put a hand near my elbow, not touching, but close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off his skin. He told me to stay back. His voice wasn't unkind. It just carried a gravity that told me this moment mattered more than anything he could warn me about. The investigators started moving around the bear dust, rising with each step. One knelt beside it, gloved hands brushing away loose debris. Another shined a flashlight into a tear in the abdomen, the fabric singed at the edges. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until the deputy leaned in, froze, and then slowly straightened with a look that hollowed out my chest. Radios lit up all at once, sharp bursts of static, clipped messages, words I couldn't make out. The tone alone was enough to make my heart sink. A forensic tech jogged over from a truck carrying tools in a case that clinked as she moved. The heat from the burned structure radiated against my arms, and the air tasted faintly metallic like old pennies left in a hot car. When the tech began to cut into the bear's torso carefully, deliberately, everything around me slowed. The sound of the blade slicing through ruined fabric felt louder than it should, like tearing into a secret the world had been holding too long. Sawdust spilled onto the ground in soft, dusty clumps. Beneath it, I saw something hard catch the light, something rounded, a shape no taxidermy piece should hold. I felt my knees go weak, and for a moment the world narrowed to a thin tunnel. I remember reaching blindly for the hood of a car just to steady myself. My breath came shallow, carrying the scent of scorched fur and smoke deep into my lungs. When they opened the bear fully, the truth lay there in the hollowed-out cavity, a truth shaped like a person curled inward, bones worn pale from time fragments of fabric still clinging to what had once been a jacket. A scrap of blue material lay against the edge of the cavity, stained and brittle. A metal frame surrounded the remains, built as if the person inside had been part of the structure itself. Someone gasped behind me. Someone else cursed under their breath. And all I could do was stare at that shape, feeling my chest pull tight in a way no breath could ease. They removed the bones piece by piece, laying them gently onto a sheet. I saw a hiking boot, cracked and blackened, but still recognizable in its outline. A plastic card, warped but still bearing the faint imprint of letters. A watch face, the glass shattered. Briggs came to stand beside me. He didn't need to say anything. His silence told me he had known long before the rest of us that whatever they found would change everything. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, scraped raw at the edges. "It's him," he said. The sound of those words didn't crash into me. They seeped in slowly, like cold water rising around my ankles inch by inch. Part of me stayed frozen in place, while another part drifted upward, watching from somewhere far above my own body. I couldn't cry, not then. The grief was too large to find a route out. Investigators moved around us like careful shadows. They photographed the scene, measured the position of each fragment, sealed every piece in bags that rustled with a sterile crispness. Yellow markers dotted the ground like small flickers of warning. A heavy stillness settled over the neighborhood, the hum of distant traffic muted under the weight of what had been uncovered. Word spread fast. Neighbors stepped back from their fences. Reporters lingered at the edges of the street. And through it all, the burned wreckage loomed behind the investigators like a gutted beast, its ribs exposed, smoke still whispering from the corners. The owner of the property, a taxidermist named Raymond Cole, had been taken to the hospital earlier unconscious from smoke inhalation. Briggs told me they would question him once he was stable. A deputy mentioned that Cole bought old mounts second-hand sometimes from other hunters. Something about a man who sold him this particular piece years earlier. A name passed between them quietly, someone who lived off the grid, someone familiar to local rangers. The pieces began to align not into clarity, but into the shape of a long, dark corridor we would soon be forced to walk down. As the sun dipped behind the trees, the scene grew colder. A breeze picked up, carrying ash across the ground in thin trails. I stood beside Briggs while officials secured the yard, installing floodlights that cast harsh white beams over the workers. The glow made everything look unreal, too bright, too stark. I asked if I could see the remains one more time before they took them away. Briggs hesitated, then nodded. A tech peeled back a corner of the sheet, just enough for me to see the curve of a bone, the frayed edge of fabric that matched the jacket I had seen so many times in our hallway. My hand covered my mouth before I even realized I'd lifted it. They closed the sheet again. The techs carried the stretcher with a slow, reverent care, moving toward a van that waited with its doors open, interior lit with soft, clinical light. I watched until the doors closed, sealing away the final evidence of what had happened to him. For a moment, everyone stood still. Then the radios crackled again, orders, updates, instructions. A chain of decisions began unfolding, each one leading us deeper into the truth. Briggs turned to me, his expression carved with exhaustion, and told me I'd need to come with him to the sheriff's office. There were statements to give, questions to answer, procedures they had to follow. His voice was firm but kind, the way someone speaks when they know the road ahead will be long. As we walked toward his cruiser, the floodlights hummed and the wind carried the scent of smoke across the street. A low rumble from a generator vibrated through the ground. The sky had gone the color of faded slate, and the first stars were faint above the haze. I opened the back door of the cruiser, the metal cold under my hand, and sat down slowly. The night closed in as Briggs pulled away from the scene, and in the silence that followed, I felt the weight of a new reality settle on my shoulders. heavy, permanent, and impossible to put down. We were only at the beginning of what would come next. The hours right after they found Dan felt muffled, as if the world had been wrapped in heavy cloth. At the sheriff's office, the fluorescent lights hummed with a cold, steady tone that settled into my bones. People moved past me in slow lines. Deputies with clipboards, investigators carrying sealed bags, a victim advocate who brought me a cup of water I never drank. Every sound felt both distant and too close. I remember resting my fingertips on the edge of a wooden table, feeling the grain under my skin as if that texture might anchor me. It didn't. Nothing did. Families started arriving one by one. My brother came first, winded from the drive over the mountains, his jacket smelling faintly of pine and gas station coffee. He wrapped an arm around me the way he used to when we were kids and didn't know what else to do. Later, my sister showed up with eyes already red, holding onto her purse strap so tightly her knuckles were white. Even in that room wrapped in the strange mix of smoke and office air, she whispered that she'd hoped right up until the call that it wouldn't be him. That somehow this discovery might be something else, someone else, anywhere else. I understood. Hope has a way of hanging on too long. News moved quickly through town. By evening, neighbors were leaving casseroles on the porch without knocking, unsure what to say, but wanting to do something. Folks who had followed the case for years stood a little quieter at the grocery store, stepping aside, offering small nods that carried more sympathy than anything they could put into words. It was a strange, fragile kindness, the kind that comes when a community has been holding its breath for too long. The investigation shifted immediately. What had been a cold trail suddenly flared into something urgent. Detectives tracked down leads that had been sitting in old folders for over a decade. I watched Briggs grow thinner in the weeks that followed, his voice rougher, his steps quicker but more measured. Every file seemed to carry its own weight, and he carried all of them. When they finally connected that old hunting mount to a recluse living deep in the forest, when they traced it back to that weathered man who had left civilization behind, it felt like the last piece of a puzzle that had taken too many years to learn. When the arrest came, it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like a long-held breath released into cold air. Levi Harrington wasn't some enormous figure from nightmares. He was small, worn the edges of his life frayed like an old jacket. When deputies brought him in, he spoke in the low, measured tone of someone who had been alone too long. His confession wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It came out almost as a tired explanation, as if he'd been rehearsing it in the quiet of the woods for years. He admitted he'd fought with Dan after stumbling upon him on that trail. He said it plainly without drama. One moment of anger, he called it. One blow. A body he didn't know how to face. And then the strange, methodical steps he took to hide it using the only craft he understood. Hearing that stripped something inside me bare. I didn't cry right away. The shock was too deep, like a cold that seeps into your spine and takes hours to thaw. I just sat there listening, feeling the same tug in my chest that I'd felt the night Dan first went missing. The kind of grief that hollows you out before it can even settle. The trial took months. Harrington's attorneys tried to argue isolation, instability, fear. But the evidence was there, the meticulous way he'd handled the body, the distance he'd traveled with it, the long, aching silence he left behind. In the end, the jury saw it for what it was, a violent act followed by years of concealment. When the verdict came down, guilty on all major counts, I didn't feel relief. I felt a quiet, steady ache. Justice can close a door, but it doesn't always dim the room behind it. Over the years that followed, life didn't return to normal, not exactly. But it reshaped itself around the edges of what happened. The kids grew up faster than I would have liked. Tyler stopped leaving his bedroom light off at night. Megan started checking the locks twice before bed. I tried to keep routines steady, packing lunches, driving to school, folding laundry, while the evening news murmured in the background. but some nights the house felt too big, the silence too thick. On those nights, I found myself standing in the doorway of Dan's old workshop, my hand on the cool frame, breathing in the faint smell of motor oil that still clung to the walls. People in town carried the story, too. For a long time, hikers avoided certain trails. Folks glanced over their shoulders more often in the woods, listening to the crack of branches in a different way. And every October, when the air sharpened and the leaves thinned out, I could feel the whole community remembering not out loud, but inwardly with that same quiet nod they used to give me in the aisles of the store. Briggs called once a year just to check in. He didn't have much to say, and neither did I. Sometimes the line went quiet for a moment or two, the soft static carrying whatever we didn't know how to put into words. He retired not too long after the case closed, moved to a smaller town near the coast. But I know he still thinks about it. You can hear it in the way he pauses between sentences, as if he's looking back down a road he walked too many times. The forest changed for me after all of it. I used to think of those woods the way Dan did, a place to breathe, to shake off the noise of the world. Now, whenever I drive past the tree line, I feel something shift in my chest. It's not fear exactly. More like a memory of fear, echoing just enough to make me roll the window up and look straight ahead. It took a long time before I could set foot on a trail again. Even now, when I walk the easier paths near the river with friends, I catch myself listening to the stillness a little too carefully, hearing the wind move between branches the way you listen for a voice you once knew. Grief has its own seasons. Some years it arrives heavy, settling on the shoulders in a way that feels familiar. Other years it comes softly, almost tender, showing up in the small things: an old jacket I find in the closet, the sight of a thermos on a store shelf, the smell of fall rain on dry earth. You learn to let it walk beside you without letting it carry you away. I've learned that justice and closure aren't the same. Justice is a verdict, a sentence, a folder closed in a sheriff's office. Closure is quieter. It shows up in the moments when I can talk about Dan without losing my breath, when I can look at old photos with the kids and feel gratitude alongside the pain, when I can stand on the porch at dusk and let the evening settle around me without bracing for something to break. What lingers most is a single image, the bear scorched and broken, lying in the sunlight as the truth finally emerged. I still see the dust drifting through the air, catching the light like pale ash. For years, that image lived in my mind like an open wound. Now it rests like a reminder, not of the horror, but of the strength it took to face it, of the strange ways the world reveals what it's been holding back, of how even the darkest secrets can be brought into daylight by the quiet persistence of those who refuse to stop looking. If you're still here with me, let me know where you're listening from, and follow the channel so these stories are never forgotten.